Washington's strategy for the Revolutionary War took into account the poor soldiery of his men, the complete absence of an American navy, and the logistical difficulties the British faced when fighting in America. He doubted his men's ability to defeat the British on the battlefield, but hoped that they could do well enough to remain in the field and draw the war out. As a student of early modern warfare, he understood that wars are primarily contests of administration and attrition, and that in a long war, the rebels could exhaust British logistics, finances, diplomacy, and political will. General Howe, likewise, the British commander-in-chief, likewise understood from the start of the war that even though Britain was much stronger and richer, many of its advantages were diminished in the American theater. In fact, already in 1774, when Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, Howe warned Lord George Germain, the Secretary for American Affairs in London. Howe warned him that Britain would need to send 14,000 regular troops to saturate New England in order to prevent a general uprising. Otherwise, he cautioned, a rebellion might break out that would necessitate many more than 14,000 men to suppress. In the summer of 1776, when he landed in New York with 30,000 men, Howe was hoping and planning for a short war, one in which decisive early victories in the field might convince Americans to come to their senses, lay down their arms, and enjoy peace and prosperity as part of the British Empire. He had clear plans to capture the Hudson Valley and thus isolate New England to the east. He did not have a clear determination, however, regarding the level of military intensity that he would utilize in his campaign in America, in New England, as he had planned it. Germain advocated a scorched earth policy with the paramount goal being a quick entrapment or destruction of Washington's army by forcing Washington to try to stop this ongoing violence against American towns, farms, and civilians. Germain held that because there was no center to the rebellion, because there was no American capital, uh, the rebellion would persist as long as the main rebel force remained in the field. Thus, he advocated winning the war militarily first, and then worrying about rebuilding the bonds of friendship and loyalty later on. By contrast, the Howe brothers, the commander-in-chief of land forces and of naval forces, the Howe brothers felt that a scorched earth policy, even if it were successful militarily, would only feed anti-British sentiment in America and would thus necessitate stationing an army of occupation in America after the war, after the victory, to prevent future unrest. Moreover, like many in England, the Howe brothers were convinced that the rebellion was carried forth by a vocal minority and that there was a strong, silent, loyalist majority that was not strong, but numerous, silent, loyalist majority that was forced to remain silent due to patriot intimidation and violence. Therefore, the Howe brothers wanted to use their army and fleet gently to impress and intimidate the Americans rather than to terrorize them, burn their farms, seize their crops and livestock, and destroy their infrastructure. They considered the American war to be a war over hearts and minds of Americans, and therefore they did not want to act roughly so as to meaning with physical force and cruelty and just to kind of to unleash the war machine against the American population and thus lend credence to patriot propaganda about British tyranny. And indeed, this kind of internal conflict that you see in the Howe brothers' strategy for the war, you can see it in the terms of their appointment. Okay, they were appointed by the crown to act as peace commissioners once the rebels surrendered. Okay, so on the one hand, they were generals in a war, they were commanders in chief in a war, but at the same time, they were also peace commissioners. And the result of this was that they were not simply concerned, like Germain, with just winning the war. They were thinking also about the war's impact on post-war relations. And this might explain the Howe brothers' perplexing failure to capture or destroy the American army at the Battle of Brooklyn Heights in 1776. Okay. That was arguably Britain's best chance throughout the war to do irreparable damage to rebel forces. Okay. Now, some argue that unfavorable winds prevented Admiral Howe from entering the East River and thus trapping Washington's army in Brooklyn, 28,000 men. Others suggest that it was not unfavorable winds that prevented Admiral Howe from doing this, but just a lapse of judgment. Some claim that General Howe was cautious by nature and constantly feared that he did not have sufficient manpower to accomplish his mission. Others defend Howe, pointing out that he followed the accepted European practice, as well as the lesson that he himself learned as an officer at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, considering his limited manpower, he chose not to risk a frontal assault against an entrenched army, Washington's army. After all, as peace commissioner, Howe was interested in de-escalating the war by persuading the colonists that his army was unstoppable, that resistance was futile, and that surrender was the only responsible and reasonable solution. Okay? Given that, a single tactical defeat at the hands of Washington at Brooklyn there would make this scenario completely impossible. Okay, it would give hope to the Americans, and it would therefore force the British to wage multiple campaigns in America. Okay, so he just didn't want to take even a small risk of defeat when he had such an overwhelming advantage without engaging engaging an entrenched army. Moreover, even a successful assault on Washington's army spelled danger for Howe. Because a massacre of George Washington's men in Brooklyn threatened to inflame Americans further, converting loyalists in the middle and southern colonies into patriots. Okay. So Howe chose instead to besiege the Americans and force a surrender over time without losing British troops, without risking defeat, and without annihilating the rebel army. Now, Washington managed to save his army and perhaps, well, not perhaps, and save the Patriot cause by spiriting the army out of Long Island, taking advantage of Admiral Howe's failure to take command of the river, to kind of block his escape. In the following weeks and months, Howe slowly and cautiously pursued Washington up and down the Hudson River Valley and New Jersey, inflicting casualties and taking captives throughout the campaign until Washington eventually managed to cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in December of 1776. So the Battle of Brooklyn Heights and the long, dismal retreat that followed the Battle of Brooklyn were were important in shaping Washington as a general. They instilled in Washington fear and caution. He never again allowed himself to be drawn into such such a strategically risky situation. By the same token, the New York campaign convinced General Howe that the rebellion was no longer limited to New England alone, if it ever was. No longer trusting that Germain's plan to occupy the Hudson River Valley could prevent a long war by isolating New England, Howe made one last attempt to win the war quickly. What he hoped to do was to recreate the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, setting up a large-scale battle that would, this time around, destroy the American army and thus win the war. Now, to draw Washington into such a battle for a second time, Howe threatened Philadelphia, which was the seat of the rebel government. His hope was to compel Washington to defend his capital city and the Continental Congress itself. So Howe defeated Washington at the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, but again failed to end the war on the battlefield. So convinced that the war could not be won, he resigned his command at this point. From 1775 to 1781, the British Army's operations meaning from the very beginning to the very end of combat operations in America, the British Army's operations show the British High Command grabbing at straws strategically, formulating a plan for victory in Massachusetts in 75, only to change it in 1776 with the New York campaign, abandoning the 1776 plan in 1777 to target Philadelphia, changing course again in 1778 with Clinton's Southern campaign, and then forsaking the Southern campaign, the Southern scheme in 1781 for operations in Virginia. Okay. These shifts in geographic focus represented conceptual shifts in strategy, from trying to pacify the Americans through economic asphyxiation, to targeting their army, to conquering territory and shoring up loyalist local governments, to again shifting back to seeking a decisive battle on the field. At each stage and in every location, British strategy expected and depended on what the British believed to be a strong loyalist support system in any given region, right? In the middle colonies, the southern colonies, the Trans-Appalachian West. Okay, so the British Army traveled from colony to colony in search of loyalist manpower that could make its war plans feasible. Okay. But the loyalist groundswell never materialized. British policymakers were trapped in a misunderstanding of the conflict. They believed that the Patriot movement, the Patriot opposition movement, was a radical and fringe element in American society, when in fact, the revolutionists' understanding of English law, of the imperial constitution, and of Parliament's lawlessness was conventional and widespread and mainstream in America. Only in 1781 did the British government finally comprehend that it would not find loyalist support in America, and that winning the war without the colonists' help was beyond Britain's financial capabilities. And at that point, they gave up on winning the war and started peace negotiations. Thanks.